In the grim history of World War II's darkest chapters, few entities embodied depravity like the Ravenwolf Brigade, notorious SS unit officially known as Sonderkommando Reinhardt. Even among the horror of the Nazi regime, this group stood apart for its unmatched cruelty and criminal composition. An internal SS memorandum would later note, "Reinhardt's men are not soldiers. They are a gang of predators wearing uniforms." The genesis of this unit cannot be separated from the man who created and led it. Klaus Reinhardt is born in 1895. In Bruckheim, Germany, Reinhardt initially followed what seemed to be a conventional military path. He volunteered in World War I, where he was wounded 6 times and decorated for valor, earning both the Iron Cross first and second class. His time on the Western Front with the 114th Grenadier Regiment forged a reputation for brutality and fierce commitment to mission objectives. After the war, Reinhardt pursued academics and earned a doctorate in political science from the University of Frankfurt. His dissertation ironically focused on labor service systems, an academic cover that belied his developing obsession with domination and violence. The years between the wars revealed Reinhardt's true nature, a zealous early member of the Nazi Party from 1922. He took part in the failed beer hall putsch of 1923 alongside Adolf Hitler. Through the 1920s and early 1930s, Reinhardt became notorious in Starkenburg, where he led a faction of the SA known for violent street brawls, heavy drinking, and open misogyny. Despite his academic prestige, his political and social behavior grew more erratic. In 1934, his Nazi career was derailed when he was convicted of sexually exploiting a 15-year-old girl from the League of German Maidens. During the court proceedings in Starkenburg, additional accusations surfaced. Reinhardt had allegedly assaulted at least 6 other underage girls. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, expelled from both the Nazi Party and the SEA, disgrace that would have permanently buried most political careers in the image-conscious Third Reich. But Reinhardt had friends in high places. One of them was Otto Heisler, a former fellow officer in the SA, who had risen to become a high-ranking official in the SS. Heisler lobbied hard for Reinhardt's rehabilitation. In a memo to Heinrich Himmler in 1940, Heisler described Klaus Reinhardt as a true Aryan spirit whose minor moral shortcomings should be excused for the greater cause of the Reich. To prove his loyalty, Reinhardt volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War with Franco's nationalist forces in 1936. There, the Condor Legion, he embraced a campaign of terror. His methods during the Battle of Teruel in 1938, including the execution of captured Republican fighters, foreshadowed the mass killings he would later commit on a larger scale. Returning to Germany in 1939, Reinhardt brought with him renewed prestige, a Spanish cross in silver, and political protection. The Nazi hierarchy was looking for unorthodox solutions to an increasingly dire problem: a shortage of men willing and able to do the regime's dirtiest work. And Reinhardt had a plan. Heisler proposed a radical idea to Himmler: recruiting convicted poachers into a special commando unit. The theory was that poachers had the skill sets necessary for anti-partisan operations, tracking, sharpshooting, and navigating forested terrain. Himmler approved, and in June 1940, Sonderkommando Orenburg was established under Reinhardt's command. This initial detachment of about 80 men, all convicted criminals released from prisons and camps, marked a dramatic departure from SS norms. The SS prided itself on purity, discipline, and ideology. Reinhardt's unit, by contrast, was built on criminality, obedience through fear, and total detachment from ethical constraints. One of the first men recruited was Rudolf Metz, a poacher from Bavaria who had served 8 years for shooting a gamekeeper. He quickly became one of Reinhardt's most trusted officers. Others followed: ex-convicts, murderers, burglars, and sex offenders, many of whom had little or no military training but were ruthlessly loyal to Reinhardt. By 1941, as the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union Operation Barbarossa spread German control across Eastern Europe, the Ravenwolf Brigade expanded dramatically. Its recruitment criteria were relaxed further. Now it wasn't just poachers, but rapists, sadists, and killers who were welcome. The unit began to function less like an army battalion and more like a state-sanctioned death squad. One of Reinhardt's key lieutenants was Kurt Vicher, a former concentration camp guard and convicted murderer. Vicher brought with him the horrifying techniques he had honed in the camp's beatings, executions, and psychological warfare. These methods soon became standard within the brigade. SS personnel records from 1941 show Reinhardt's official promotion to SS Obersturmführer, first lieutenant, along with the notation, particularly suited for unconventional operations. Unconventional was an understatement. Unlike other SS units, the Ravenwolf Brigade underwent minimal formal training. At Sachsenheim camp, their preparation revolved around building loyalty to Reinhardt personally. There were no drills, no chain of command, and no concept of military honor. Discipline was enforced through random beatings, executions of dissenters, and a brutal code of internal terror. In one well-documented case, Reinhardt shot a soldier named Franz Schiller for refusing to participate in the execution of villagers. His death sent a chilling message. Mercy was treason. A former brigade member, testifying at post-war trials, said plainly, "There were no rules. That was the only rule." The unit's behavior sparked outrage from within the German military. General Max von Heltenstein, overseeing operations in occupied Belarus, wrote a scathing letter to the Wehrmacht High Command in late 1942, describing Reinhardt's brigade as criminal, counterproductive, and an insult to the German uniform. Civilian administrators echoed this concern. Hermann Schall, the regional administrator of the Borinsk district, filed a formal complaint, noting that Reinhardt's indiscriminate killings were depopulating entire agricultural zones and ruining Nazi efforts at forced labor and resource extraction. These protests, however, went nowhere. Himmler dismissed them outright. Reinhardt, far from being disciplined, was promoted to SS Sturmbannführer and praised for exceptional success in anti-partisan warfare. By late 1942, the Ravenwolf Brigade had grown into a battalion and was deployed to territories like Ukraine and Poland, where partisan resistance and Jewish communities provided new targets. Their success was not measured in strategic objectives or captured ground but in body counts. Historian Dr. Christian Halberstam, writing in his landmark study of the unit, observed, "The Ravenwolf Brigade was not an aberration of Nazi madness. It was its final form, a fusion of ideology and criminal instinct, operating without restraint, accountability, or mercy." Their story had only just begun. The whispering forests of Varillo, a region nestled between the marshes and ancient villages of Eastern Europe, became a silent graveyard in the summer of 1942. It was here that Klaus Reinhardt's Ravenwolf Brigade unleashed a reign of terror so ruthless that even hardened German officers recoiled in disbelief under the deceptive name Operation Thorncatcher, which was officially described as a counterinsurgency mission. The brigade began a systematic extermination campaign, targeting anyone suspected of aiding partisans. The reality, however, bore little resemblance to military engagement. Instead, the Ravenwolf Brigade engaged in the wholesale slaughter of innocent civilians. Reports from German military archives later revealed an alarming disparity in these operations. Reinhardt's unit would claim thousands of bandits neutralized, yet recover only a handful of weapons. In one operation alone in August 1942, near the Pirate marshlands, the brigade reported killing 6,657 people, while recovering just 259 firearms. The clear implication was undeniable. Their victims were overwhelmingly unarmed. The village of Borval, once a thriving settlement with a population of over 2,000, became a ghost town. In November 1942, Reinhardt's unit massacred 1,741 residents, including 950 children. The brigade's operational diary, captured after the war, contained a chilling entry under that date: "Objective secured. Village no longer exists." Their methodology was precise and horrifyingly repetitive. Upon entering a village, Reinhardt's men would quickly seal off all exits, trapping the inhabitants. Entire populations were herded into central squares, where selections were made. Those deemed fit for labor were shipped off to work camps in Germany. The rest, the elderly, the sick, and the young, were forced into large buildings, often barns or churches, which were then set on fire. In the village of Drino, 284 people were locked inside a church and burned alive. Vadia Konovich, the sole survivor, later testified at a Soviet tribunal. They packed us in like kindling, fell beneath the weight of the others. Then they threw in grenades and poured gasoline through the windows. I only survived because corpses fell on top of me, shielding me from the flames. German officers on the ground could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Captain August von Kessling, stationed near Myansk, described one such massacre in his memoirs, The Screams. From inside that burning schoolhouse will follow me into the grave. And outside, Reinhardt's men were laughing. As the weeks passed, the brigade's tactics devolved further. What had once been described as discipline through terror morphed into a sadistic culture of games and torture. Survivors and German witnesses reported that Reinhardt's officers devised contests to entertain themselves, ranking each other based on cruelty and creativity in killing. One such game, documented in post-war testimonies, involved forcing naked women to retrieve objects from frozen ponds only to use them as target practice when they emerged. Another involved injecting prisoners with strychnine to observe their convulsions, which Reinhardt allegedly referred to as field experimentation. SS Rottenfuhrer Joseph Bleicher, one of the few brigade members later tried for war crimes, testified, "Even in the SS, we were expected to kill, but Reinhardt's methods were something else. He turned murder into performance art." A town deep in the forested interior, women were forced to strip naked and dance around a fire made of their own clothing before facing grotesque humiliation and death. In some instances, children were impaled on bayonets or thrown into burning structures, while the men laughed and jeered in Peklin. According to the records of the Eastern War Crimes Commission, Reinhardt's soldiers lined up children shoulder to shoulder and used a single bullet to kill as many as possible in one shot, treating it as a competition. A German military police report from October 1942 stated bluntly, "Sander Kommando. Ours behavior toward the virillo civilian population, particularly children, reflects a level of barbarity unseen even in this brutal theater. In Kaslava, 26 children were corralled into a schoolhouse and executed one by one while the others watched. The last child, Mikhail Petrenko, was spared temporarily, only to be used as a living target for bayonet drills. Even the upper echelons of the SS, a regime not known for moral hesitation, began to express discomfort. SS liaison officer Hermann Vogler, who would later become a brother-in-law to Hitler, wrote in a secret dispatch, "Reinhardt's men shoot children for sport. This is no longer war. It is lunacy." Yet Reinhardt continued to enjoy protection and promotion. In 1943, Heinrich Himmler visited the Ravenwolf Brigade personally and commended Reinhardt for his unflinching resolve. He was promoted again, this time to SS Obersturmbannführer, and given expanded jurisdiction over operations in Ukraine and Poland. Historian Ingrid Neumeyer, in her post-war analysis of Reinhardt's campaign, wrote, "Reinhardt's brigade was not merely tolerated by the Nazi hierarchy, it was cultivated as a tool of state terror. He and his men were not rogue actors. They were the intended outcome of Nazi ideology pushed to its logical extreme. Where others killed out of orders, Reinhardt's men killed out of pleasure, and they were rewarded for it." By August 1944, the Eastern Front of Nazi Germany was crumbling. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly, and the Polish underground saw an opportunity to strike. On August 1st, the Polish Home Guard launched the Warsaw Uprising, hoping to reclaim their capital before Soviet liberation. In response, Nazi high command turned to its most feared weapon, the Ravenwolf Brigade. Under the command of Klaus Reinhardt, arriving in Warsaw on August 4th, Reinhardt's unit numbered roughly 865 men. Their reputation preceded them. That number would rise to nearly 2,000 as reinforcements. Primarily convicts and foreign conscripts were funneled to the brigade. SS Gruppenführer Heinz Reinhardt, overall commander of suppression forces in the Wola district, reportedly warned his staff, These are not soldiers. They are beasts on vodka. Do not try to control them. Just unleash them. Heinrich Himmler's orders were clear and unequivocal. Any inhabitant of Warsaw you encounter is to be killed, man. Child. What followed over the next 5 days was one of the most concentrated massacres of civilians in modern warfare. The Walla massacre began on August 5th. As Reinhardt's men swept west through the district, entering buildings and executing everyone, inside, hospitals, churches, schools, no place was spared. Witnesses described the brigade turning St. Magda's Hospital into a furnace of horror. Patients were shot in their beds, doctors executed mid-operation. In one horrifying case, the building was set ablaze with wounded still inside at the St. Agatha Infirmary. Dr. Zygmunt Krasivsky was performing surgery when Reinhardt's men stormed the ward. He later testified, "They shot my patient on the operating table, then they lined us against the wall. I escaped only because a shell struck the building, allowing me to crawl out through rubble." The most appalling episode came on August 5th, when over 40,000 civilians were massacred in just 72 hours. Churches were filled with villagers and machine-gunned. At the Urbansky textile mill, over 4,000 civilians were shot against the walls. In execution lines, witnesses from the Polish underground reported that Reinhardt personally toured execution sites, pausing only to select young women for his officers' entertainment before they too were murdered. In the captured student dormitories of Zeliana, women were taken daily to makeshift torture rooms. None returned. Their screams could be heard for hours through the rubble. Janina Rasinska, a survivor of one such center, described, "They would drag girls away at night. We never saw them again." The men joked about keeping trophies. The Ravenwolf Brigade's savagery began to hinder its own tactical mission. Despite being tasked with suppressing an armed uprising, Reinhardt's men were so consumed with raping and killing civilians that they failed to engage real insurgents effectively. SS Oberfuhrer Erich von Dembach, assigned to oversee the suppression, eventually intervened. On August 9th, he ordered a partial halt to mass executions, not out of compassion, but practicality. Reinhardt's troops are so busy murdering civilians, they forget we have an armed enemy to fight. During combat with actual resistance fighters, the brigade showed spectacular incompetence. At the barricade on Okapova Street, a single Polish unit, armed with a machine gun and Molotov cocktails, repelled 3 consecutive assaults, killing over 70 Ravenwolf troops. A war diary entry by General Nikolaus von Vorheim, commander of the German 9th Army, observed, "They can murder unarmed women, but collapse in the face of resistance. They are not a military formation, they are rabid dogs." Survivor accounts of Wola paint a haunting picture of carnage. Wanda Lurie, pregnant at the time, was shot 4 times and buried beneath corpses. She survived and later gave birth to a healthy child in a transit camp. Elzbieta Ostrovska, a resistance courier, escaped a makeshift brothel run by Reinhardt's men, describing women being tortured with lit cigarettes and broken glass before execution. A Polish doctor overheard a Kaminsky Brigade officer. SS formation whispered to a comrade after witnessing Ravenwolf in action, "We kill, yes, but they torture. Even we have limits." Reinhardt had turned a city into a living hell, and still Himmler praised him. Reports indicate that after touring the aftermath in Wola, Himmler approved the expansion of the Ravenwolf Brigade and awarded Reinhardt the German Cross in Gold. Despite this, casualties were staggering. In 10 days of real fighting, the brigade lost nearly half its strength, unable to match partisan resistance with training or tactics. Reinhardt replenished his numbers with conscripts, Hungarian Jews, Soviet POWs, and criminals enforced them into suicide missions as ammunition carriers and human shields. SS Gruppenführer Heinz Reinhardt, infuriated by this, reportedly radioed Berlin, "What am I to do with these degenerates? They are more danger to our side than the enemy." And still, the killing continued. From Wola to Ochota, from hospitals to churches, the Ravenwolf Brigade reduced Warsaw to blood and ashes. But this was not their final theater. More horror awaited. On the march to Slovakia and Hungary, where desperation would turn Reinhardt's men even more monstrous, and their reckoning would begin. As the walls of the Third Reich crumbled in late 1944, so too did the structure and sanity of Klaus Reinhardt's Ravenwolf Brigade. Once bolstered to nearly 4,000 men, the unit had been reduced to a patchwork of criminals, addicts, and broken conscripts by the time they reached their final theater, the mountains of Slovakia, the frozen hills of western Hungary. After the blood-soaked nightmare of Warsaw, Reinhardt's brigade was quickly reconstituted, restocked with more convicts, Soviet prisoners, and foreign mercenaries, and deployed southward to help suppress the Slovak national uprising. Though the operation would end in Nazi victory, it would expose the brigade's fatal flaws: cowardice, chaos, and cannibalistic violence. In the mountainous villages near Banska Bystra, Reinhardt's men encountered determined partisan forces led by seasoned Slovak officers. The Ravenwolf Brigade, unable to function in disciplined combat, suffered staggering losses. German after-action reports from October 1944 note that the unit lost 216 men in just 3 weeks. But these weren't just battlefield deaths. They included desertions, friendly fire, and internal executions. The brigade had become a roving death cult, devouring itself from within. Yet the savagery continued. In Kremnica, Reinhardt's men executed 747 civilians, including 211 women and 58 children, dumping the bodies into anti-tank trenches. Captain Jan Stanislav, a Slovak partisan commander, later remarked, "They fought as they lived without honor, without courage. They were lions only when facing the unarmed." As winter approached, the brigade limped into Hungary, tasked with defending strategic towns against the advancing Soviet army. But discipline collapsed completely. A Wehrmacht liaison, Captain Rudolf Lindermann, reported in December 1944, "The Ravenwolf formation is no longer a cohesive unit, but a gang of scavengers roaming westward." Desertions exploded particularly among non-German volunteers. November, half of the eastern conscripts had fled, many vanishing into villages disguised as civilians. Some sought surrender to Soviet troops, but that path was suicidal. In the Hungarian town of Ketkol, 23 former Red Army soldiers conscripted into the brigade attempted to surrender to Soviet troops. Their Ravenwolf tattoos and blood group markings gave them away. All 23 were executed on the spot. Within the brigade itself, violence surged. SS Hauptscharfer Franz Majal noted in his field journal, "Third Company, discipline non-existent. 2 men shot for attempted desertion last night. The others watched. They are already dead inside." Still, Reinhardt pushed forward, now obsessed with holding his ground. Near Lake Balaton, the brigade was ordered to stop the Soviet 6th Guards tank army. They had no anti-tank weapons, no artillery, and barely any ammunition. Intercepted radio messages from this time reveal sheer desperation. Enemy armor breaching. From west, ammunition depleted. Request permission to withdraw. Soviet intelligence, aware of the brigade's atrocities in Warsaw, made them a priority target. War correspondent Ilya Arnberg wrote in his frontline dispatch, "We have identified the butchers of Warsaw. No quarter will be given." On February 14, 1945, Soviet T-34 tanks overran Ravenwolf's headquarters near Sikafalvar. Of the 122 men captured, only 14 survived long enough to reach prisoner-of-war camps. By April 1945, the brigade had disintegrated. Rumors swirled that Reinhardt himself had abandoned the unit, fleeing toward the Alps with a personal guard. In truth, he had been wounded by shrapnel in February and evacuated to a field hospital in Oltush, but perception was more powerful than fact. Morale shattered. What little remained of command broke down into fractured bands of men, each trying to surrender to the Western Allies, anyone but the Soviets. In Austria's Tyrol region, Sosober Sturmfer, Kurt Fischer, and 30 of his men surrendered to the American 42nd Infantry Division on May 3, 1945. They wore stolen Wehrmacht uniforms, but were identified by concentration camp tattoos and Ravenwolf insignia hidden in their kits. Elsewhere, remnants of the brigade met gruesome fates. Near Pribram, Czech partisans captured 14 Ravenwolf members. According to post-war records, they were buried alive in a collapsed mine shaft, as revenge for wartime massacres. Klaus Reinhardt's own fate would become one of the most debated epilogues of the war. The snowy hills of Altshausen in Germany were quiet on the morning of June 1st, 1945, when French troops captured a man hiding in plain sight. He wore civilian clothes, carried forged identity papers under the name Gregor Heisler, grim joke referencing his powerful SS patron, Otto Heisler, and claimed to be a traveling merchant. He was not. He was Klaus Reinhardt, the monster behind the Ravenwolf Brigade, according to the French occupation report. Reinhardt was held at a makeshift detention facility of former Wehrmacht barracks in the town of Altshausen. He died there 6 days later, on June 7th, officially due to cardiac arrest following physical trauma. The French military doctor, Dr. Marcel Leger, signed the death certificate. But the truth, as with many Nazi epilogues, is far murkier. Multiple sources, including Polish forced laborers, who had been freed and were serving as temporary guards, claimed that Reinhardt had been recognized, then beaten to death in his cell. In an act of vigilante justice, former Polish resistance fighter Jan Podolski, in a 1981 interview, said plainly, "We knew exactly who he was. What happened to him was nothing compared to what he did in Warsaw." 1960, Reinhardt's body was exhumed during a West German war crimes investigation. The autopsy revealed broken ribs, a shattered jaw, and trauma inconsistent with combat injuries. The conclusion? Death by beating. Still, rumors of his survival persisted. During the 1950s, Israeli and German investigators tracked sightings of a man using Reinhardt's known aliases in Egypt, Argentina, and Syria. One file from West German intelligence references a man named Joseph Wagner, who entered Argentina in 1948, settling in the Belarus region, a well-known haven for escaped Nazis. Simon Wiesenthal, the renowned Nazi hunter, investigated several of these claims. His verdict: Reinhardt died in 1945. The ghost sightings reflect our fear that such monsters could escape. It's not any reality. Yet if Reinhardt's death marked the end of the man, it did not erase his shadow. Many mid- and lower-ranking members of the Ravenwolf Brigade successfully reinvented themselves in post-war Germany. In West Germany, Cold War priorities often took precedence over justice. With the growing Soviet threat, former SS men were quietly reintegrated into law enforcement, military intelligence, and industry. One such figure was Heinz Barthold, who had overseen executions in Verillo. He lived under his real name in East Germany until 1981, when a survivor recognized him. He was tried and sentenced to life imprisonment, but released in 1997 due to ill health. He died a free man. Another was Kurt Langen, a former Ravenwolf Company commander. He became a respected police officer in Frankfurt in the 1950s. His past was uncovered only in 1964, when a Jewish survivor recognized him during a routine traffic stop. He was sentenced to 4 years for involvement in 3 massacres. Upon release, he told reporters, "Germany has moved forward. So should we." Still others took their skills in terror abroad. Several joined the French Foreign Legion, fighting in Indochina and Algeria. SS Unterführer Konrad Schern, a known participant in the Warsaw atrocities, died fighting the Viet Minh in 1954, under the alias Claude Servin. Others were recruited as mercenaries, interrogators, or advisors by authoritarian regimes in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. The techniques they honed in the forests of Verillo and the streets of Warsaw lived on in torture chambers in Santiago, Algiers, and Damascus. One such figure, Friedrich Schwenk, who had been Reinhardt's logistics officer, later became an intelligence consultant in Chile and Paraguay. In a 1979 interview with European journalists, when asked about his past, he replied chillingly, "Counterinsurgency is counterinsurgency, whether it's against partisans in Verillo or communists in South America." The Ravenwolf Brigade did not vanish. It mutated, infecting the post-war world like a cancer whose roots were never fully cut. In Poland, the legacy of the brigade remains a living wound. Towns like Kharton, where entire communities were erased, were rebuilt, but the scars remained. A single statue stands in Kharton Square, a man holding a burning child, Joseph Kaminski, the town's blacksmith, who returned to find his son still alive in the ashes, only to die in his arms. Moments later, his testimony became the basis for Alika Adamovich's haunting novel, Ashes of Kharton, which ends with the line, "The dead cannot cry out for justice. It is the duty of the living to do so for them." Reinhardt's brigade is remembered not for its battlefield victories, it had none, but for a singular, horrifying legacy. It institutionalized sadism. It showed what happens when criminals are given power, when ideology erases morality, and when systems reward the worst impulses of men, as Polish poet Tadeusz Rołach, a survivor of the Warsaw Uprising, wrote in his 1947 work Massacre of the Boys, "The killers simply changed uniforms, the blood dried, but they walked free under new suns, their crimes buried with their victims. The war ended, the uniforms were burned. But the pain and the truth remained. We must never forget.